stuff in Africa is so insane. Is so insane.
I got married to a Funko Pop. We got wedded, conjoined in a Subway shop. I am married to my Funko Pop. We got joined, coitus in a Subway shop. Vitamins and biscuits and minerals, they come to me through a tube. My whole life is spent watching on a tube. I'm married to a Funko Pop. We got wedded, we got joined in a Subway shop. Vitamins and minerals, they come to me through a tube. Vitamins and minerals, they come from me through this here tube. I got married to my Funko Pop. We got wedded, we got joined in a Subway shop. Love at first sight, love at first sight. What shall I do with love at first sight? Put it in my hand, throw it on the ground. Who knows? Just what will I do?
We got wedded, conjoined in a Subway shop.
Guinea pig stuff in Africa is so insane. The human guinea pig stuff in Africa is so insane.
Welcome, everybody. Hope you're having a good day. At least we had a little bit of a respite with a little bit of good news. I think most of us were hoping that we wouldn't be under another 4 years of wine mom frontispiece control. And essentially everything that I predicted in last night's stream has come to fruition. So some people said, yes, Jay, we have recognized you as Black Hebrew Israelite prophet number 1. I am now the top prophetic office holder of the Black Hebrew Israelites. And props and shout out to Yakub, my maker, for making such an evil cracker man with such extensive predictive skills and beautiful visage. So shout out to Yakub. We did have total Yakub victory yesterday overall, I think. But setting aside Yakub, shout out to everybody in the chat. Welcome, everybody. I have to point out that I was completely accurate on Bitcoin. Did I not tell you that if Trump won, many of us would wake up a lot wealthier today? And thank God for that, because the markets reacted accordingly as we expected. I think today was my single largest Bitcoin day of all, going back to 2017, like the single biggest daily gains. So thankful for that. I don't have any intention of slowing down my stacking and holding these bags. So glad to be in the situation. It's a blessing, and hopefully we have other high IQ individuals that are doing well in that regard too. Today we're going to be talking not about Bitcoin per se, but not just the victory in this sort of political football game, I guess. And, I don't want to spoil anybody's parties, but remember we talked about the limitations of the presidency and what he can and can't do in last night's stream. And we had a lot of fun, but today's going to be a little more of a historical sort of philosophical discussion. I want to go into the psychology of the left and how the left is ultimately a kind of a spiritual delusion. And I want to do it from the vantage point of some of the historical figures that are really important in the left and today's so-called leftism. And remember, ultimately, it's certainly, unfortunately, the case that even today's so-called conservatism is really just another form of liberalism. But a lot of people still don't understand why that is the case. I was reminded after this election and in regard to the numbers that popped up that half of the nation is literally insane goblin demoniacs. And it has to be half. Now somebody said, well, not all of this number, it doesn't matter whether the number is accurate. It's enough of a gauge for me to know that 66 million plus people are walking around essentially mentally insane. And how do we get to that? How do we get to the point where, how could anyone, I can't understand what's happening for a person that they would support Kamala Harris. Well, I think we're going to have to do a little bit of a historical journey, a historical process, and understand how we got to where we are after the Enlightenment. We haven't talked about this in many years. It's always good to review. In fact, I would say, since we've talked about this, we're not just talking about the cultural effects, not just toxic culture and TV and all that. No, I want to talk about the political ideologies that have evolved. And we haven't talked about this in many years, and we have, again, I probably have 100,000 subscribers since I've talked about this. So we're gonna go through some of that history because I'm just once again smacked in the face and reminded, even after last night's, reality stream, we wanted to be sober. And everybody was saying, hey, man, you had the most sober, accurate analysis, and everything that I said yesterday came true today. So we want to talk a little bit again about what we want to expect, or what we should expect. Be ready for the crazy stuff that's going to come. Have accurate, realistic expectations about what it's even possible for the presidency to do, to remember everything that Cameron talked about in last night's video. Otherwise, we're really just setting ourselves up to be duped in this dupery game of the political process. And the political process, as we know of it, is itself a product of liberal civilization, Enlightenment civilization. What do I mean? Elections, party politics. That itself is part of the Enlightenment heritage. Now, as you guys know, not everything that we've talked about and criticized, not everything Enlightenment is bad, but a lot of the Enlightenment is bad. And one or two of those things that come to mind are, just first and foremost, the absurdity of elections in general. I mean, this is just so silly if you stop and think about it on a national scale. Now, there's flexibility, I think, in terms of societies, how they want to govern themselves, what types of things they want to set up, for people groups determining their own destinies and their own futures. They don't have to all have the same forms of political expression or governance and so forth. So there's freedom and I guess you could say flexibility here. I think the forms themselves are almost always going to tend towards the hierarchical. There's never, ever, ever going to be any kind of really egalitarian style of society, utopia, whatever. It's just never, ever going to happen, for one, because it's contrary ultimately to the principles of nature themselves, in my view. You don't really see this in nature. I mean, people come up with sort of obscure, there's this bug in the Amazon and they actually live in a... No, look, none of that really matters on the whole, because humans are not like bugs in this respect, or at least in regard to some bug that lives in some communal way, which probably doesn't even really exist. Humans tend towards appreciating successful paternal relationships. And I think this is the root of monarchy, is the idea that since family is so fundamental, and since humans are actually constituted to have essential realities, biological realities, the most natural form of government and governance in the human sphere will be some form of paternalism, paterfamilias, and monarchy. And so the family and a royal family becomes a kind of an icon or kind of an image that ideally the rest of the nation wants to emulate, wants to take pride in, etc., etc. Now, as we know, that doesn't always happen effectively in history. Certainly hierarchies can be abused and so forth. But the problem with leftism and the whole history of it is precisely, first and foremost, this egalitarian, equalitarian mistake. The idea that everyone is fundamentally identical, equal, and some kind of like manufactured unit, like a bunch of widgets coming out of a factory or something, right? And the reality is, of course, humans are born with different skill sets, different qualities, different abilities, already stamped into their very being, into their soul. Now that right there is a huge departure point for a lot of the modern world. And that's because leftism, liberalism, progressivism, etc., all the way back to the Enlightenment, are essentially premised, maybe not so much in the first stages of the Enlightenment per se, but they're really beginning with the assumptions of some elements of Greek philosophy, believe it or not. One of those elements of Greek philosophy that they start with is this idea that no man sins or does evil knowingly. And this is something that Plato, for example, was a proponent of. In this tradition, in its idea, in its notions, the only way that you would ever do something immoral has to be because you don't have enough facts. But of course, the problem with this is that it overlooks other means and reasons why humans might do evil actions. What if lack of knowledge is not the only reason that humans choose vice or choose evil? What if we're fallen? You see. So right away, there's a disconnect between a worldview that believes in fallen humanity versus, say, a Greek metaphysic or a Greek philosophy that doesn't believe in a fall. It just locates vice in a lack of proper education. And also in that view of the Greeks, there's no such thing as grace. And so really, again, all that's necessary is the right set of facts. And if you have the right set of facts, then you will choose the good. But not everybody wants the good. What if people are, in some cases, absolutely malicious? What about the evil genius? I mean, the evil genius has presumably not just all the facts, but many more facts available beyond everyone else. And if you read something like Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, you get an idea of this kind of line of argumentation to refute the Greek notion of evil really just being located in man's ignorance. What if it's not an intellectual problem, but rather an issue of the heart? And that's really where Orthodox Christianity really departs from the Hellenic Greek ideas. Now, in the Enlightenment, we get a return in many ways to Greek philosophical pagan traditions. Not in total. And I don't mean the more superstitious metaphysical aspects of Greek metaphysics. Rather, a return to, as Peter Gay called it in his famous books, Enlightenment paganism, or Greek rationalism. And this is not surprising. Of course, the Enlightenment, many of those characters are reacting to superstitious Roman Catholic excesses, abuses, theological errors, many of which I would agree with. Now, some of those mistakes had already been called out by the Reformation, right? So, when we talk about the excessive and bizarre views of the supererogation of the merits of the saints, all kinds of weird ideas about female spiritual mystical piety, scrupulosity, etc., etc. All of these things that you see Luther and Calvin and other people whining and fussing about, some of which have basis in reality. The extreme then is to go all the way. This is just what humans do. They swing all the way to the other opposite. When sometimes, many cases, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. And so modern leftism really cannot be understood or divorced from the idea of, as we said, first and foremost, locating all of man's problems, not in anything internal per se in terms of the heart, but rather in education up here, intellect, and in the fact that there is no nature which would have anything to do with man having these vices or so forth. In other words, in the nature versus nurture debate, it's all nurture, right? Think of the most common leftist kind of, people in the ghetto, they only rob or steal because of poverty. They only do these things because of poverty. And if we could just cure poverty, suddenly we would have people acting virtuously? This is so dumb, right? But this is a lot of really stupid people believe this. They think that there's a necessary connection between curing poverty that will then lead to virtue. And yet the same people turn around and point out that the wealthy people are the wicked people. But wait a minute. So I thought you just said that curing poverty would create virtuous ghetto citizens. And yet, when you talk about wealthy people, they become a class of oppressors, the very root and source, supposedly, of many or most social ills. Then, as you can imagine, leftism is also premised on this idea that more and more and more education, hence great society, hence welfare programs, hence state-funded drug programs, and on. All of this education is what will somehow cause the virtue and the good actions of the citizens. But that itself presupposes a kind of blank slate tabula rasa human nature, which is precisely what we're talking about. And the idea is well, if since man we know post-Enlightenment is just a piece of putty to be molded, stamped, and formed by society, there's nothing innate. There's no innate human nature. There's no innate soul. There are no characteristics stamped on the person from God. They're just products of their environment or of nature itself. The products of blind random processes, you see. And so the idea then becomes to form and to create and to mold the perfect man, the right man, the man of the future, the new man, as the Marxists and communists later talk about, right? The Soviet man, etc. It's essentially the creation of the perfect external environment, which can tweak and manipulate the stimuli to produce the effect that they want, to produce the being that they want. Again, all operating on the assumption that there's not a soul, or that there's not a principle within man given by God or something like that that makes him a unique being. Again, everything is pretty much nurture. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, haven't been phases of, say, atheist, materialist type people who believed in, no, it's everything is nature, not nurture. Right, so that you can fall on two sides of that extreme there. But in this regard, no, we're saying that there's only really, in modern progressivism, the assumption, for the most part, that the solving of man's ills comes about through tweaking and fixing the external, the social order out there, and not really anything to do in here. Except that at times they also do fall back on the sort of genetic determinism, perhaps more so amongst the academic, psychological, or technocratic elite, right? Which believe that, no, actually we can tweak man and fix man internally through transhumanism, microchips, genetic DNA manipulation, etc. So sometimes they do sort of switch over into this genetic determinist type of camp, and this would be maybe more so Malthusian-minded people. But those people are not in the majority when it comes to the left, right? That's very much the minority of people on the left, right? People like Hans Eysenck and people like that who have been in trouble for scientific publications and discoveries that go against the mainstream liberal orthodoxy of so-called scientism and psychology and whatever. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying that Hans Eysenck is necessarily therefore all correct in all of his eugenics and Malthusian ideas. I'm just pointing out that those just tend to be the minority amongst liberal academia. So the nature versus nurture debate, I think, pretty much ended up being almost wholly dominated by the left siding with the idea that everything is essentially an environmental, external, nurturing stimuli. And hence the assumption that all of these, external means and programs can somehow tweak and fix man. And this is what undergirds even public education. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't believe in educating the populace. But I don't know that means, and I don't think that means that the state or the federal government should be in charge of educating the population. There are plenty of private organizations, religious organizations, etc., that I'm sure could do a far better job of educating than some sort of, gigantic federal, whatever, Soviet-minded program that's literally copied from the Prussian socialist model of public education. So, as we're, speaking about the Enlightenment and the revolution and those characters, one thing that we should keep in mind is the oddball nature of the individuals in the French Revolution. Thank you guys for those super chats. If you guys would hit like and share. We got 1,000 live and only 257 likes. You guys don't. I thought this is what you guys want. Isn't this what you want? Of course, it's what you want. And now, my sources for this are not just from Fire in the Minds of Men, but Fire in the Minds of Men is probably overall the best encapsulation of what we're talking about in this first part of tonight's talk. And that's the early revolutionary phases of the mindset of the left, the psychology and spirituality, so-called, of the left. Because we're gonna say, I think, that leftism is really a spiritual disease and delusion. Is the premise or the conclusion of tonight's, the theory of the thesis of tonight's talk. Excuse me. And Billington, of course, as you guys probably know, if you're not a stranger to this channel or new here, Billington was the Librarian of Congress, and so this is a classic book from an establishment academic person on the history of revolutionary thought, and he characterizes it in a very religious way. It is the origins of the revolutionary faith in the subtitle. And of course, Billington is a believer in the revolutionary tradition, and he sees accurately the ethos of America as an Enlightenment product and project, expressing precisely one arm or one branch of this dialectical revolutionary oppositional faith. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're not familiar with these topics, this book is, of course, a great place to start in terms of actual academic historic scholarship. So a couple of these figures that we read about that come to the fore are people like Marat, Robespierre, Danton, Babeuf, right? And these figures who sort of became demagogues and very vocal figures at the time of the French Revolution, which is where pretty much unanimously all scholars are going to date and trace modern liberalism. And we're talking about liberalism in the true, accurate, historical sense. We are not talking about necessarily the Democratic Party in today's two-party politics. We will get to that. But right now we're talking about the Enlightenment heritage, which begins as capitalism, as part of the Enlightenment heritage, and then the birth of socialism or modern socialism after capitalism. So remember, before we get today we're not talking mainly about economic theory, but before we get Danton and Robespierre and Marat and all these characters, you have to have the prior phase of the laissez-faire economic theorists. You have to have Locke, Ricardo, Adam Smith, and even Kant. Then these are all the original what we could call liberal. This is where we get the term neoliberal. Neoliberal refers to economic theory, primarily here. Meaning things like we should open up the markets to not be governed by state tariffs. The king shouldn't be, giving licenses to this or that guy. Should all be up to who has the best products. Now that sounds good in practice, but as you can imagine, there's a reason that kings had tariffs, and it wasn't just always for taxation and for self-enrichment. Tariffs also protected the guilds and the craftsmen within that nation state. And so if I was a part of a shoe cobblers guild in England in the 1400s, and I had been taught this trade, and I took a lot of pride in the crafting of the shoes and the drip that I put into these crafted shoes, if there were suddenly no restrictions or no tariffs or whatever, and then suddenly millions of, say, Chinese shoemakers flooded in, and the Chinese make these very cheap, different types of shoes, and they destroy me and my shoe guild, you see. The point there is that that's not good for the worker. And the open trade or open borders policy actually has its origins in this type of laissez-faire capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying then that socialists had the answer. Now, I don't believe that socialism or totally free market, laissez-faire, they're two sides of revolutionary thought. And this is why it's so difficult, just like it's as difficult to explain to people the fraudulent nature of the two-party system. They can't see past either you're a libertarian or you're a socialist. You're either an anarcho-capitalist or you're a Marxist. Well, what if I think both of those systems are really products of the rebellion of man against hierarchy, order, church, and state? And that's really what just nobody's prepared to go there yet. Now, I will say one positive sign is that although I've harped on this for many years, maybe 15 years, I figured all this out at least 15, 20 years ago when I stopped really being super duper libertarian. And I really only had that for a brief phase. That was a few years. It wasn't that long. People are just the one bright sign is that we have seen Peterson, I think through Pajot, begin really to critique the ideas of Enlightenment. And as you probably saw, this really made Dr. James Lindsay mad. So, and I'm not saying that I think Jordan Peterson is going to save Western civilization. Look, come on, dude. Like, I've been critiquing these positions in classical liberalism way before anybody else was. Way before. I was critiquing classical liberalism even before the ALTRIGHT people were. So I've known about this because I had really extensive undergrad classes on all these topics. And because I was into traditional Catholicism in 2003. So I was already into tradcat, ideas and critiquing classical liberalism and all of that, literally before most of y'all had got out of your diapers. So come on. You don't have to explain to me about this kind of stuff like I don't know about it. I know this topic very well, and I've studied it for a long time, but I don't really talk about it that much because it's just not that relevant. I mean, it's taken, for example, the Pajot-Peterson sphere. It was 7 years ago I did my critique of classical liberalism, and now we're beginning to hear Jordan Peterson agree with some of those critiques. Now, I don't know that means he's watched my stuff. He probably hasn't. But probably indirectly, some of the criticisms that have been out there for a long time have maybe filtered their way to him. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is just that it is nice to at least begin to have some questioning of the Enlightenment out there. If you go back 10, 15 years ago when I was being pretty insistent on debating and critiquing and arguing against some of this stuff, there was nobody. I mean, literally nobody would even listen to a person criticizing classical liberalism. I mean, classical liberalism was just everyone's bread and butter. Or they were just straight up socialist Marxists, right? But at least we're beginning to think about the possibility. Ideas are beginning to be put out on a decent sized scale that challenge these entrenched dogmas of either socialism or classical liberalism, right? Can we begin to think outside of that either or? Can we begin to think about thinking outside of the idea that somehow democracy or even Republican democracy is somehow sanctified and hallowed? Says who? That it literally makes no sense. Remember in the January event a few years ago, and Pelosi spoke about the hallowed halls of democracy being defiled. He's speaking in this religious language. And so, democracy as religion, as just this, and half the people, probably most of the people that if you were to ask them, well, explain to me what democracy is. Tell me about ancient Greek democracy. Tell me about its origins. How did they operate? Did the children vote in ancient Greek democracies? You think they let everybody vote? Obviously, we know that that's not the case. But again, democracy was intended for most likely small, male-dominated societies where men were land-holding, tax-paying individuals. I'm not a fan of taxes. I'm just saying that was the idea. So this preposterous notion that, which we have today, that democracy somehow automatically values all people in society equally because they merely exist is preposterous. Even the democratic elements of the American system still assumed that you would be a landholder, that you had some stake in voting because you had skin in the game, right? So random indigent hobos don't have the same stake in the game as the landholder man. Obviously. Children aren't competent and fit to vote. Women also should not ultimately be voting. They never have voted because women were not seen to be in the role of being involved in world affairs and keeping up with civics and the issues in the news and this and that. It's just not the role that women were assigned in life. That was up to men, just like going out and doing, soldier type jobs. Like that's left for men. And the more societies conform to those roles, the more healthy and functioning they are. The more that they deviate, the more you get abnormal, dysfunctional societies. And that's precisely what happens in the characters that we're going to look at right here, these French Revolutionary characters who are ideologues. And like many leftists that you probably know or have known or whatever, maybe you were at one time, the problem with this position is that it takes what seems to be ideal or rational to this or that revolutionary and to assume that that could be forced into and stamped into reality on a large scale. And they're so narcissistic on the whole, these sort of revolutionary liberal leaders, that if there's something that doesn't fit, why, it must obviously be the fault of the person not fitting into my mold here. And so they must be dispensed with. Clearly, that's the only possible option. And that's the insane, tyrannical narcissism of the revolutionary leader, the leftist leader. And so, as you may have heard, conservatives have really been saying this for a long time, but it bears repeating because it's a really essential element to understand the psychology of the leftist, the liberal. And that is to understand that there is a narcissism and self-worship that underlies every single liberal proponent and ideologue. And yet at the same time, there is a hatred for the people. Now that might seem odd because, wait a minute, I thought they were the men of the people. I thought they were standing up for the masses, for the people. You see, the leftist sees himself as a salvific figure for the masses, this collective blob, this abstracted blob. So he loves and wants to save humankind, but he actually hates people, you see. That's a very, very crucial, brilliant insight that I heard some years back from a conservative. Maybe it was even David Horowitz that said that. And I thought that's actually really profound. That's absolutely correct. Every leftist committed person, activist, etc., on a one-to-one level, they're usually described as some of the worst people. They're hateful. They will lie, backstab, cheat, do whatever. And they have no moral compunction at all about doing it, because for them, all of their actions are justified to save humanity. And I mean quite literally here that many of the leftist ideologues and activists literally have a God complex. They have a savior complex. Many people have, for example, pointed this out about George Soros, that he's talked on occasion in interviews and sort of views himself as this person who, with that wealth and power that he has, will save society, mankind, modernity, whatever. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that this never exists on the so-called right. I'm going to again stress that really we have to toss out left and right. A big root of this whole problem is left and right itself. It needs to go. So keep that in mind. I will dispense in total with the left-right paradigm, which is a control mechanism that's actually kind of a distraction. It's a smoke and mirrors deflection from a right-wrong paradigm, virtue-vice paradigm. That's the true-false paradigm, the good-evil paradigm, the virtue-vice paradigm. That's the right one. But instead, we always have to be focused on a dialectical setup, which is itself a product of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, that power is somehow inherently bad. Now, I know that sounds odd because you're saying, wait a minute, revolutionary leftists think, yes. Remember, going back to the revolutionaries, much of their rhetoric, much of their writings are bound up with the notion that power somehow itself is a problem and what corrupts people. Not, again, remember, not what's in man for the leftists. It's not a fallen heart. It's not a wicked heart. For the early progressive revolutionary era leftists and liberals, perhaps what corrupts man is not just society, but also things like possessing power. Power is somehow the source of corruption, which then corrupts the male leader usually. And then that corruption is expounded throughout society because of the environment, because of nurture, right? So power itself has to then be taken away and supposedly dispersed amongst the many, or amongst the masses, or amongst the representative Republican committees or whatever. But is it power itself that is the problem? Is it power itself? I mean, in other words, isn't kind of power unavoidable? So it's not power that's the problem. It's wicked men in power versus good men in power. But you understand that because this is already beginning on the premises that there's not good and evil. There's not wickedness and virtue and vice. There's power and abuse of power. And hence the revolutionaries were themselves set against all tyrants, supposedly. But for them, tyrant really just equaled anyone who had power, be it church or state. And by extension, also the money class, which is ironic, the merchant class, because originally, if you think back to in time of the Enlightenment, when we get the rise of liberal economics with Locke, Ricardo, Adam Smith, and others, the idea at that time is that power should be opposed and wrestled from the state, and it should be in the hands of the merchant and banking class. So understand that the neoliberal economic theory of the Smiths and the Ricardos and the John Locks and others at that time is not really about freedom and what, I don't know, libertarian party economic theory tells you today. It was about the merchant and banking class wanting some of that power that the state had. And so they said, oh, power is a problem. It must be wrested away from the state, and then it'll be fair. But what ends up happening isn't that power, it just shifts. You say, power doesn't actually really get limited. It simply shifts to new power blocks. And so the very people, the very revolutionaries, the very before them, the merchant class that wanted to wrest some of the power would make holding power or having power itself the source of tyranny, and then they themselves take power. And so we find out that the attacks on power itself are really hypocritical. They're more of a tactic, a cunning technique to gain power, rather than actually limiting power. This then becomes, I think, the source of the intentional disconnect in liberal democratic societies between the actual holding of power and the belief in who has power. So in these supposedly democratic and equalitarian free societies in the modern world after the revolutions, and right, so after the the Masonic revolutions to overthrow, throne and altar, in the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, and then we get into, the late 1800s, early 1900s, the world has essentially been changed to reflect revolutionary philosophy in some form. Most governments in the world, especially the Western world, have become liberalized, meaning that church and monarchy really have no more role for the most part. There's a little bit of that here and there. But whatever monarchs perhaps do continue to exist, or noble families or whatever, they're really displaced by the people, by the merchant banking class, you see. And that's a fact that even Quigley admits in Tragedy and Hope. But this creates a divorce in democratic liberal societies, so-called, a divorce between what's professed to be believed in terms of the national myth, the Constitution, the elected leaders, etc., and what really runs those societies. And so there's a fissure, a divorce, because what ends up happening, as the ancient Greeks ironically said a long time ago, when you get rid of hierarchy and you supposedly have democracy, what you really end up with is oligarchy. And that's the difficulty here, is that these democratic liberal societies purport to be governed by law, purport to be free markets, purport to be based around freedom of the individual, maximizing all of that. Now, we're not talking about socialism yet. We're talking about the Western capitalist, democratic, free market republics that were established post-French Revolution. America, for example, right, is the shining example of this. But, of course, most of the Western world, and even beyond, has in some way adopted these liberal forms of governance. They're based around the idea of power comes from the bottom up, which again is the reverse of what these guys were. Because remember, power itself is supposedly a problem and a thing that corrupts to the revolutionary mind. And so they wanted to limit it. But that really doesn't address the fact that, well, in this type of a society that we're setting up, we can have a rise of a new billionaire class or oligarchical wealthy class that has power. And so it's just really stupid and naive to think that there are mechanisms or machineries that will somehow create fair societies or cause there to be virtue in society, and that there won't be tyrants or something like that. I mean, it's just really kind of foolish. And again, it's a naive, stupid view of human nature itself, to assume that human nature could be tweaked by the environment or by the democratic constitution or whatever, such that it will act virtuously for what? Economic gains? I mean, it's kind of just stupid. It's a really nonsensical, divorced from reality, idealized view of what human nature or humans are. And that makes sense because the Enlightenment was itself largely based around the universalizing of what humans are and human nature is. But a lot of those universalized principles based on pure reason and rationalism and the Enlightenment ended up being themselves the things that would deconstruct Enlightenment. And that would take the left in the direction of postmodernism. So we talked about the notion that power itself is a problem, but also at the back in the time of the revolutionaries and whatnot, what we get then is the idea that because power is a problem, it must come from the bottom up. The people are the ones that create and endue anyone with power, and any legitimacy in any form or fashion, whether throne or altar, legitimacy is determined by the masses. And even if you have a republican form of government, that's still odd, because it's like, well, legitimacy will be determined ultimately by the masses for anything to do with law and state. It just won't be by all of those masses. It'll be like out of the 5 smartest of the masses, right? So that's more the Republican idea. They'll elect a committee that will decide. But it's still a very bottom-up idea, as if that's the source from which power and legitimacy comes. Why? On what basis? You understand this is just a dogma. It's just an assertion that power comes from the people up. Says who? How do we know that? I mean, maybe it does. But these are Enlightenment dogmas that, as I said, those Enlightenment principles themselves would eventually eat. Like a self-eating Ouroboros snake chewing on its own tail forever and ever and ever. And again, you're going to notice that as we progress through Enlightenment thought, Enlightenment thinking, or revolutionary thought and thinking, it always has within itself the seed to destroy itself, ironically. And even though it continues to do that, it doesn't go away. It merely morphs into a new form. And that's, I think, the most fascinating thing about leftism, which ultimately means that it's nihilistic and satanic, is the power that it has to morph and change and be the opposite of itself and still continue on. And that lets you know that it's more than just an idea. It's actually a spiritual evil. It's actually the demonic. So power is a problem. Power is inherently evil. Power only comes from the bottom up, from the people, supposedly. I don't know why we're supposed to live, but those are the dogmas of the revolutionaries. The revolutionary liberal, as we said, has his hatred for mankind and seeks for hatred for people, but salvation for humankind. And he has this abstracted universal ideas that he must force reality into. And if reality doesn't conform to his ideals, then reality must be damned. In other words, off with their heads. They're the problem. The reason my utopia isn't here has to be my critics. And all of the other people that don't fit into my supposed utopia, well, then I guess they have to off with their heads, you see. But there's something else going on with the revolutionary that you probably noticed in the character of Danton. Does Danton look like he's not really a hottie, is he? I mean, he's kind of got like a monkey-ish face going on here, right? He's kind of a goofy-looking dude. Babeuf himself, Babeuf, guess what he was? A journalist. Yes, they had blue check marks back in the time of the French Revolution. And Babeuf eventually started putting on weight, and if you don't know the story, the other revolutionaries tattled on him and said, hey, Babeuf, he needs to be put to death because he's obviously eating too much if he's chunky, if he's got a bubble gut going on, if he's got a thick with triple C ass, then he's eating too much. That's bourgeois. And he's not living in a true revolutionary way. Because no revolutionary would be overweight, even though they're pretty much all fatties. And so, famously, Babeuf gets snitched on as being too overweight and therefore too bourgeoisie. and not truly living the asceticism of the revolutionary faith as it was required for those who were truly socialists at that time. But what do we see in these examples of Babeuf and Danton is they're ugly dudes. They're physically repulsive and probably on a personal level repulsive. So wait a minute. Why would a revolutionary leader, what's the connection between being physically repulsive and being a revolutionary leftist? Well, precisely that. Being an outsider, being considered ugly, purple-haired freaks, fatties, etc., that alienation from the social order, not having the means by which to attract a mate, then allows those people to envy, have resentment towards society and towards the healthy functioning members, and then they thus coalesce in their victimhood oppressed minority status, you see. And I'm not saying every minority is ugly. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying that the characterization that we see in a Babeuf or a Danton, they embody the malformed, abnormal elements, even physically, even the physiognomy of the revolutionary leader often tells you that he can get laid. He's probably an incel, and he's going to be at the hoe house, essentially, is what we're saying, right? And I'm not actually exaggerating there. In fact, Rousseau famously spent a lot of his time doing philosophizing at the hoe house. And it's not by accident that Rousseau is, again, one of these characters who seems to have these aberrations in his personality and his psyche, which leads him to then say that all society should rather adopt to my vices. It's not me that's the problem. It's not my vices and my mental illnesses, and many of these revolutionary leftist leaders were actually mentally ill. Some of them were founding communes. Some of them thought they were new savior figures. Some of the women, commune crazy people, they thought they were female Jesus. So there's delusions going on. There's narcissism going on. There's envy and resentment going on because many of these people are just damn ugly. Looking like heifers, right? All that's going on. And in their mindset, this was true even back then, which is pretty amazing comparing to, the exact same modus operandi of today's leftists, is that society must change to fit me. The greatest example of this, of course, is fat acceptance. And remember when this was really being pushed, maybe 2016, remember Tessa Holiday, the supermodel, who was massively, Ibarra level overweight, right? Just massive. Now that's kind of been normalized because you go to the mall, you look at magazines, the mannequins, the models, they're all massive now. Or they're at least included as part of the ads or the modeling. So that has been somewhat successful in terms of getting their agenda through. And fat acceptance, I think, has been overall successful because all of these tone policing crusades against shaming have kind of been successful through the support of censorship and big tech, right? Because it became part of victim status that you cannot be shamed and that shaming is equivalent to hate. But as many of these people knew, really if they could alter society, it just meant more of a way to provide for their vices. And that's we can't overlook this basic level. And ironically, to highlight, well, I wouldn't say ironically, but highlighting again why this type of governance in society doesn't work and doesn't function, is that democratic societies, liberal, open societies, by their very nature, must have, by their leaders, the broadest base appeal. And the broadest base appeal, when combined with social engineers and revolutionary elite-minded leaders who are very cunning, who know how to debase the population, it's a never-ending cycle of the political class and the elite controlling class constantly degrading the population as they require more and more of a broader base to have power and control. We're talking about the so-called political class, the supposed leaders that run things. I'm just pointing out the internal inconsistencies within so-called democratic governments themselves. This leads to this never-ending cycle of, on the one hand, the elite class degrading the population to control them, and then the political class pandering to more and more of a common denominator to appease degraded degenerates. You see how that works? That cycle is precisely where we are right now. That's why things don't change, is that nothing will ever change until there's a return to a notion of a right-wrong paradigm, virtue-vice paradigm, versus left-right. Because left-right is itself based in subjectivist, liberal, relativist ideas. Remember, there's no objective principles of transcendence and God and whatever, and a state that is actually coronated by the religious power, showing that power comes from God from the top down, not from the bottom up. The notion of hierarchy and the coronation of the church, of the king, shows divine sources of authority. In these systems, all of that is wiped away. Well, what other sources of authority could there be? Supposedly, the bottom up. But what I'm pointing out is that, as even the ancient Greeks knew, this is really just oligarchy, not power from the bottom up, but power from the manipulative elite class that can control the bottom up, you see. And that's where we get social engineering, we get political chaos, trickery, corruption, sexpionage, all of this even existing back then, of course. And so the reason that those democratic egalitarian societies don't function is because their leaders are themselves dysfunctional. And they misdiagnose individual and social ills because they themselves can't make sense of society and have no standards other than themselves. And thus, they become demagogues and tyrants themselves because they have the supposedly abstract perfect system to stamp into society to make it conform to their ideals, which is really just ultimately this ideal they have is merely a reflection of their own vice. And so society degenerates. You get more and more promotion of misfits, the ugly, the miscreant, the scallywag, the bald-head scallywag. A cacistocracy, as it's called. Governance by the worst. Because this model internally necessitates it. And it is ultimately just oligarchy. Likewise, we saw as the connection, for example, between in medieval Europe, the notion of the witch and how the witch blended seamlessly into the feminist movement at the time of the French Revolution. Mary Wollstonecraft, many of these other socialist revolutionaries after the French Revolutionary characters, we saw many of them being actually women feminists, and many of these guys were absolute feminists. Many of them, of course, had no problem totally being hypocritical and contradictory about that. For example, Rousseau spending his days at the whorehouse, but probably believed in some form of female liberation. And even in today's leftism, when we look at, I remember one of my best examples of this internal contradiction within the mind of the leftist was in one of my philosophy classes in undergrad. And I had this, she's still a leftist, but she was a big fan of Nietzsche, and she appreciated, some elements of the so-called right or whatever. But she was still obviously at heart just a leftist. I remember in one of we had this debate between the feminists in class, right? So basically, there's me, probably a handful of dudes, and then probably majority 7 or 8, because usually in academia, in the humanities, is still female dominant. And I remember this class. It was so funny because the debate was over female circumcision. But the problem is that to the normie liberal, you're a cultural, social relativist. But at the same time, every liberal, of course, liberal today, has to vehemently defend feminism and women's rights. Supposedly what they call women's rights. But now, wait a minute. Now I'm stuck in a dilemma, because how am I supposed to defend women's rights and be a cultural relativist in idiotic, Muslim cultures or whatever in Africa that want to damage women? You see. There is no solution. Why is there no solution? Because leftism ends up being, at this time at least, grounded in what's called negative liberty. And this is because negative liberty really comes out of their economic predecessors, the capitalists. Prior to them, the capitalist, libertarian-minded people, when they thought about the state and they wanted to get the state out of the domain of the economy, the chief means to do that was to begin to talk about and limit the state through what they call negative liberty. And that just means that we're going to define the rights of the individuals by what the state can't do. But the problem is that negative liberty doesn't really give you anything as a positive application for how you ought to act. It's really just a bitching about the state and it limiting individual economic action. The American founding documents, you could say, are negative liberty type documents. They're not so much concerned with telling you what is the positive of virtue or something, the common good, right? It can't do that. Government can't be involved in that. All government can do is act in a limiting way to ensure the freedoms of the individuals in the society, supposedly. That's the, laissez-faire story from the Enlightenment period. But as we progress out of the Enlightenment, we get to these people, the revolutionary brothers and sisters of the capitalists, who then react against capitalism and its excesses with another form of liberalism, namely liberal socialism. So literally the irony that you could never have had the French Revolution had you not already had the capitalist revolution of the Enlightenment thinkers. And if you read somebody like Locke, what you'll notice very clearly is that between Locke's epistemology and his 2 treatises on the state or whatever, I've read these. I remember reading them in undergrad. They're really dry and boring, but there's a clear connection between Locke's empiricist philosophy, Anglo-empiricism, and the democratic liberal laissez-faire principles. They go together because they all assume a common anti-metaphysic, a common empiricist mode of operating, and the tabula rasa. But those models are only as good as the theories and the presuppositions are true. If the theories and the presuppositions are not true, these are going to be disastrous systems. For example, if tabula rasa is not true, then a lot of this Enlightenment stuff is gibberish. It's nonsense. And it won't work as a means of running a society. It doesn't mean the systems will totally collapse or crack down right away. It means that there will be internal inconsistencies in the systems that will play themselves out in time, either for the better or for the worse. So in other words, within the dynamic and the logic of capitalism and its Enlightenment assumptions, as capitalism begins to tell the state how it needs to be, how society needs to be, everything becomes homo economicus in some way. That's the assumption here, is that really the locus of man's operation and actions in life, they're not God, they're not virtue and vice, it's economic exchange. Once economic exchange begins to dominate, and I think Spengler was accurate to call it Homo economicus in this time period, the principles that were assumed, if they're false, they will eat themselves and destroy that existing system and produce a new form, perhaps in the worse. Perhaps it goes in a bad direction. And this is precisely what you see where monopoly, or excuse me, I should say laissez-faire early capitalism literally gives birth to and foments the socialism that is its opposition. Why? Well, because on the one hand, capitalism itself has Enlightenment assumptions and flaws that it can't justify. And there's no reason why, if you have this atheist, materialist, or even deist presupposition going on, like Locke or something like that, that people can't critique your position and say, well, if this, then this. So if Locke's empiricism is true, then it doesn't really make sense for there to be a God. So even though Locke thought there had to be some kind of God and, some sort of loose kind of Calvinism, whatever weird theology Locke believed in, if empiricism's true, the next logical phase is atheism. The God of Locke or these Enlightenment figures is really a worthless, deistic, pointless God. And so if there's not a God, then socialism, atheism seems to be the next logical conclusion, because why, if there's not a God and not values, should we prefer the individual and maximizing his freedom? Why not the collective? I mean, you don't want to be selfish, do you? Why are you being selfish, bro? You need to help people. And literally that low-level sort of absurdity is what you have. There's a dispensing of the idea of God or the deism that's in these Enlightenment era thinkers. That's dispensed with. And the preference for the individual, why the individual? Why not the collective? Well, why the collective? Why not the individual? Well, exactly. There's no reason why it ought to be one or the other. And so these people play on the existing system as the merchant class, the moneyed class. They must now be the new power elite. It's not the kings and queens so much anymore. There's a little bit of that. But the next phase of the revolution is the overthrowing of capital. Oh, you see, power is what corrupts, but power corrupts through having money, because money is what gives power. So money must now be the problem. It's the way that people are exploited. And what was the state? Remember what Marx said? Forget the exact phraseology. It's kind of a funny statement. It's something like, what is the state but the committee for the furtherance of capital, right? It's like, which is kind of true, right? But I mean, in the monopoly system, the monopoly capitalist system, if you think about it that way, it's not really the state that runs things. The state is just kind of a functionary of big capital. And that's true. It doesn't mean Marxism's true. It just means that that principle's true. That's true in the free market democratic system. So if that's the case, well, why not overthrow that and try any whatever system? Socialism, Marxism, okay, why not? If my opponent is a bunch of deistic or atheistic capitalists, like why not socialism? You see the point. Now, I'm not saying that justifies socialism, because these people can't make a justification for anything. But that's the point. Well, there's not a justification for anything, then why not socialism? Why not limit the power of the individual capitalist? And the only means to do that would be the state. Now, the anarchists thought, well, no, we could do that through, anarcho actions of the individual. And Marx said, no, you've missed the whole point. It's collective action that has the power, and only with the collective being awakened could we overthrow this. It's stupid to think of the individuals being the ones that could overthrow. And that's where he disagrees with Bakunin, thinks Bakunin's an idiot. That, by the way, plays into Conrad's Secret Agent, which I apologize, I've been late on that, but when I got super sick, I wasn't able to read. Really only one night was I able to read, but I was so sick that even reading wasn't really possible, which made it unbearable almost. But I'm over that for the most part. I'm still a little bit sick, but most of it's, I'd say 80 to 90% now. So I have only a little bit left in the book, and then we'll be able to do the part 2 of Secret Agent for subscribers, the Conrad novel. But it plays into this too, because as we saw, Conrad was discussing, anarchists and Marxists as the part of the secret society in that novel. But for leftists, socialists, to get back to our notes here, to our point overall, we talked about the modus operandi. Well, if it's the case that these systems aren't after or built around what's true, we were talking about the economic models and Marxism sort of overthrowing capital, and then capitalism and Marxism being in a sort of a dialectical necessary struggle. The other element that many people miss is the Sutton, Quigley, and others' thesis, which is that Marxism, socialism, even Spengler says this. He says you could never find a socialist movement without some capitalist behind it. And the point there is that really the rise of these are not independent organic movements. They had themselves, even at this time in the 1700s, a lot of money and a lot of force behind them from foreign nations and governments and powers and families to be used as operations to overthrow, in this case, the French monarchy. So there were actual outside forces who had vested interests in aiding the Babeufs, the Dantons, the Marat, the Robespierres, the Jacobins, and the Girondins to overthrow Louis. And not just Louis, but also the church as well. And Quigley talks about that. Quigley says there's ample evidence that certain banking houses in Europe had a vested interest in the French Revolution because, for one, revolutions create debt. They create a new collectivization of wealth and transference out of the nation. Revolutions serve a lot of purposes that are far beyond the scope of the idiot revolutionaries or the normal leftists that think that they're part of something great. They're actually tools. And as obvious maybe as that sounds to this audience, this is still not obvious to people. People still cannot wrap their heads around this. They cannot fathom the idea of capitalism and Marxism, socialism being a dialectic. It's just too there's probably no boomer that will ever get that. Very few. Very few. Partly because, of course, they were raised in the Cold War, and so they see the Cold War as really defining for those concepts, when really we're going more into a historian's perspective, bigger bird's eye view, going back to Enlightenment and French Revolution to really grasp the big picture about what liberalism is, what liberal economic theory is, what monopoly capitalism is, and then what Marxism, socialism represented. So for me, as you could probably imagine, no. Although I'm sure many members of these movements were sincere about their beliefs and really did believe in, free market laissez-faire, or these people really did truly believe in their socialism. Oh, I don't doubt that at all, because these ideas have the power of religious ideology. They essentially are. That's why Billington is calling this the revolutionary faith. They literally treat themselves like a church, like a religion. They believe in many of these revolutionaries were actually ascetics. They're not all fat hypocrites. I mean, Robespierre literally didn't have a new suit for 20 years. I mean, he was literally committed to the asceticism of a strict, hardcore Marxist socialist. But of course, there's no reason really to be that way. I mean, there is no God, so there's no reason to not be a hypocrite and live it up, right? So many of the more cunning, I think, more malicious of the revolutionary leftist types, Bolsheviks, etc., I think for them it was a lot more of a willing, just really enjoying evil. getting off on enjoying duping people, living in this almost dissociative state of accepting and furthering contradictions. And you'll notice that a lot of the Marxists would even speak that way, right? Everything is contradiction. Everything is lie. And to really be committed to revolutionary action, you live revolutionary action, meaning you must act. There must be praxis. You must embrace the contradiction. Nothing wrong with lying. In fact, lie to further the cause. And so the revolutionary, the liberal, sees all of his actions as justified because, number one, he is the source of all good and evil anyway. He's his own God. So whatever he determines is what's good. There is no good and evil out there. Good and evil is what I do and what I decide. Just like the lie of Genesis, right? But radical action requires then actions against and to negate anything that is existing, anything that has being, anything that is the now. Because this ultimately becomes a tearing down for the sake of tearing down. Even today's revolutionary forms, according to these people, are themselves still oppressive and must be torn down. This is what so many people don't understand, that they think that true leftist liberals are working for some better world. Not necessarily. The true committed revolutionary liberal must always tear down. It is always struggle. There is never end to the struggle because it is eternal, perpetual struggle, according to the true revolutionary. And in fact, you can read, like, I think it's Lenin and maybe even Mao. They would both speak of, Democritus and the philosopher of the ancient world, Heraclitus, that everything is in flux, and that means everything will always be in flux, and that means everything is revolutionary dialectic. Nature, Darwinism, revolutionary dialectic. Societies, revolutionary dialectics. Everything is dialectics. And dialectics requires you be against whatever the existing system is. So there's no longer virtue and vice. There are tools and techniques that are means towards an end, you see. Thus, radical action can take the form of anything to negate, to tear down, and to destroy the existing system, because all existing systems ultimately end up being oppressors. Even when the left takes over the system, the next generation of left must tear down that system. This is why there is no end to the what's all the terminology that they use of the intersectionality of the cisgender, heteronormative white patriarchal male, oppressive. Like, it never ends because it can never end. There is no end goal. That's why Huxley tells you what really all of this is about when he says that the final revolution is the revolution against man himself. That's what most of the normie liberal left revolutionary person can never figure out, because they don't know the inner secret of their movement has always been against man himself. And that's what Huxley explains and reveals to everyone in the introduction to Brave New World, that this is the final revolution. The final revolution is the erection of the total control grid, the panopticon secret society grid, because man is the problem. It is the revolution of man against man. This, you begin to see, is why leftism aligns with the death cult so well. To accept that the revolution is against man himself, that is the innermost secret of secrets of the inner party. And Huxley told you all that through fiction, and then admitted in the essay it's not fiction, in the introduction. That is why, for the true revolutionary here, it is a faith which can then use what formerly were vices for the end goals of radical action. Nothing wrong with envy. Ironically, the egalitarian society is premised on envy. Why should you have more than me? I deserve that. I deserve an escalade, right? Envy, greed, theft, and hate no longer become vices. They are the powers that are utilized to bring about revolutionary action. So the revolutionary ideologues are smart enough and cunning enough to figure that out. Not all of them necessarily, but they're enough to figure out how to be demagogues and how to have control a mob mentality. It's all then you see, ironically, about what? Power. Now, originally, remember these guys were fussing that power is what corrupts. And then what happens? Well, the revolutionaries come to power. And they are 10 times the tyrant that their monarch forebears were. You thought weird King Louis was bad. Oh no, you're going to get Robespierre with a committee of public safety chopping off 20,000 heads a day. Right? Way worse than what Louis was up to. King Louis was a little weird, kind of a spurg, literally. Like they can't get him to be with a woman. He's too busy making clocks and shit. He's over there like tinkering with his grandfather clock, which, nothing wrong with that. It's like, dude, you're a king. You got to produce the heir, man. You can't just be over there spurging out on clocks all day with, the Sun King, more like the incel king, right? I'm pretty sure that's Louis, right? It was not the story. They made a funny movie. It wasn't funny, but it was funny to me. It's that freaking, is it Sofia Coppola's movie with Kirsten Dunst playing Marie Antoinette, and they're trying to get Louis to like do his business, and literally Louis like obsessed with like clockmaking. It's like the spurgiest thing ever. It's like, I don't really want to go to bed right now. I gotta work on that clock, and he just loves like tinkering. I think that's right. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but it's a good analogy. Well, this is about 100 times worse, right? So, anyway. Radical action then makes use of the vices and wickedness, and it does so to make itself, ironically, align very well with death cult. And so by the time of the modern inner party, again, explicitly, Huxley tells you that the revolution is ultimately about fighting man himself. And that's because these revolutionaries had created an idea, a system that was out there, and it kind of eventually gives way to the scientism, Royal Society Malthusian idea. That's really where we end up. And it doesn't really matter about economic systems at that level. They're more so, it's just man himself. And they actually kind of spilled the beans on this when they put out the Club of Rome document, First Global Revolution. Now, you'll notice that that's not accidental that they're using revolutionary terminology. Yeah, this is at Alexander King, First Global Revolution. This is a production of the Club of Rome, which was a Rockefeller Depop think tank, very well known. This was published this is a sequel to the 1972 book, Limits to Growth. And this really kicks off the globalizing of the green movement. Now, the green movement and this kind of stuff existed prior to the publication of this. Because again, you go back to the 1970s and whatnot. But also key things happening in the 70s that they saw was the Kissinger Global 2000 report. And that was what was really the government's formal acceptance of Malthusian ideas under Kissinger, working at the behest of the Rockefeller Foundation, and especially in the Carter government. But that continued on to the Nixon, past Carter into Reagan as well. It's not like this ever went away. It began actually under Nixon and then Carter, because Kissinger wasn't able to really get this through until Carter. And Carter, if you remember, was pretty sure Bilderberg chose Carter as their, he was a Bilderberg chosen candidate 100% by admission. Now you get this Club of Rome document here as a sequel to the 1972 Limits to Growth. And what you've noticed here is that the revolution has progressed to be aligned with the idea of climate, the idea of pollution. And in fact, it is this book which has the famous statement that the real problem in the world is man himself. The pollution on Earth is man. Man is the pollutant. And so this is an explicitly Malthusian dogmatic document admitting, in continuity with prior revolutionary ideology, that the continuation of Marxism, socialism would now go under the guise of green. And if you didn't know this, let's see if we can find it. It used to be at Marxist.org. Let's see if we can find it. But some of the first modern environmental works were from Engels. And this is one of the key ways that we can connect Engels. I wonder if I can find that. It used to be on, let's try environmentalism and then the Marxist.org website. It might be from here. Yes. Marx and Engels on the environment. And of course, you could imagine why there would be a very close connection between Marxism or even what Engels talked about and environmentalism, because the idea is that, well, man is part of a collective, part of the whole. And that would include nature, from which he's alienated, right? A big part of Marxism is borrowing Hegel's idea of alienation, and that we are alienated from nature as a being of nature by the capitalist structure and whatever. And so it was very easy for Marxism to be aligned with and kind of transition into what we now think of as the environmentalist green agenda. And of course, today's Marxists, are very proud of this. Marx said, man's nature is inorganic. That is, he is an inorganic body. Nature is in that it is itself a human, is not, nature, that is, insofar as it is not itself human body. Man lives on nature, meaning that his nature is body, and he must continuously interchange if he is not to die. Thus, man is linked to nature. In most advanced countries, the following measures will be generally applicable. The combination of agriculture and manufacturing industries and the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country is necessary. So Marx wanted to erase town and country. These are environmental, you see, components of Marxism. Capital, you'll see, he goes on. I'm looking for competition compels the replacement of old instruments by new one before the expiration of their natural life. They even made this page green, which is funny. So, again, there's a very close affinity, and this is why, for example, James Delingpole, if you guys don't remember, we've done multiple podcasts with at least two on the Delingpole podcast, but some of his early books were precisely about this relationship. And James Delingpole wrote several texts pointing out the connection between Marxism, socialism, and so-called environmentalism. He wrote a book in 2012 called Watermelons, how environmentalists are killing the planet, destroying the economy, stealing your children's future. And he's arguing that they're green on the outside and red and pink on the inside, hence watermelon. So this is pretty well known. I think a lot of people probably have assumed without maybe knowing the necessary components. But the actual power elite component connections are precisely what I'm talking about in terms of things like Rockefeller Foundation, Club of Rome, World Wildlife Foundation, Annenberg Trust. These are huge, powerful entities that are self-consciously Malthusian. Aspen Institute, all those things connected to the climate agenda, the green agenda, they're all Malthusian, and they're all coming out of the same Bilderberg Rockefeller ethos, explicitly on record. And what that tells us is, again, Marxism, socialism is not ultimately the enemy of capital. It is, in fact, as the Rakovsky interrogation says, the dialectical necessary opposition and support of capital. And in fact, Marxism, socialism has always had big money capital behind it. Literally. And many think, well, that would never work because they would know. Have you ever spent much time with Marxist socialists? Do you think they really know? They're ideologues. They don't care ultimately about what's truth. And why is that? Well, truth is not a part of these systems the way that you and I think of truth. This is why, for example, if you guys remember when that lunatic Haas came on to debate me a few times, and it didn't last more than 5 or 10 minutes, is because you understand that for Marxists, truth is not what you and I think of truth. We think of truth and falsehood, epistemic justification, objectivity. That's not what truth is. Truth is, depending upon how committed or how determined the Marxist is, truth is really a tool, a technique. Truth is part of ultimately power dynamics. And keep in mind, although not true perhaps of the Marxists of the days of Marx or the socialists of the French Revolution, I think they probably believed more so in the Enlightenment ideas of, objectivity in terms of truth. Today's left has progressed beyond anything associated with classical Marxism or even its monopoly capitalist roots. Today's leftism, liberalism, has morphed into something intimately bound up with postmodernism. And this is a fascinating, kind of unexpected turn that the left would take as we move into the 20th century to discuss liberalism. So although we had at the time of Marx, Marx dedicates Das Kapital to Darwin. You've got Darwinism on the scene, getting popular. And so this is, in many ways, helping to finish bulldoze the ethos and the mindset of the previous Western European civilization, what's left of it. These new forms of mind virus, you could say, Freud, Marx, Darwin, these help to really bulldoze anything else left in tradition, be it church and monarchy. We have now the erection of essentially the worship of democratic, egalitarian, equalitarian forms of government, constitutions, etc. Even whether capitalist or socialist governments that are created. We're talking about the 1800s into 1900s now. We have we have what, after the First and Second World War, a demoralization of the progressive, it's always going to get better, utopian ideas. World War I and World War II, and this is really well known in history and academia, pretty much damaged and destroyed the classical progressivism, because it was so contrary to what they were believing and embracing in terms of their liberal institutions. Remember the ideas going back to Kant? Kant said, if we just have free trade, this will bring world peace because nobody will want to upset the trade because they're making so much money. They're making so much bank, dog. Nobody will go to war if you're getting paid. That's literally the level of what Kant's arguing. And yet, do we have that? No, we have continued war. In fact, the so-called progress of the liberal civilization ends up with World War I, the greatest world war the world had seen to that date. So how does this fit with the never-ending supposed progression? And by the way, the assumption was also that man was evolving in some upward descent, positive way. Well, we don't actually know that. I mean, I don't believe in macroevolution to begin with, which is a magical transmutation thinking in theory. But even if it were true, how do we know that it's evolving in a better way? Maybe it's devolving into things being worse. There were these assumptions even still built into Darwinism, socialism, and progressivism at these times, all of which hopes were dashed by World War I and World War II. Now, in the background, the real power behind the throne in liberalism and socialism, as you know, in my view, it's the Milner, Astor, Rothschild circles at this time. We're talking, 1890s with Cecil Rhodes. We're talking into the 1910s and 20s. And their thinking was League of Nations, this liberal order, will be the seed form of the world federation of liberalism that will set up. Literally. This is where you get Lionel Curtis, Commonwealth of God, John Ruskin's idea of the Socialist World Federation, all of these, Rhodes, Milner, Fabian thinkers who are very much advocates of Malthusianism. They're very into the socialists. They're very into panopticism of the French revolutionary theorists, the Saint-Justes and these wackos. So they're very influenced by socialism, and they have the impetus to convert what's left of the British Empire into a future world socialist order. And they agree with the tenets of Marxism in part. They agree with and eventually completely own the environmentalist movement, which morphs into and becomes what we call nowadays as it goes under the guise of World Wildlife Foundation, Annenberg Trust, Aspen Institute, all of these entities that are usually associated with climate and engineering the climate and fixing the climate. Again, Club of Rome at the heart of that. All of these are really externalizations of the revolutionary socialist technocrat model, which is not antithetical to monopoly capitalist. In fact, the monopoly capitalists are the ones who have been the chief architects and funders of this. And so leftism is not ultimately antithetical to capitalism or monopoly capital, or the merchant class or the money class. Even though that sounds perhaps hard to believe or strange, if you think about it in terms of the recent periods of chaos that we've endured, say COOF, the last 4 years, the supposedly socialist, communist, unified mind control techniques and tactics were actually put into place by the Fortune 100, Fortune 500. The socialist policies that we keep gradually adopting in America are not actually being proposed and brought into play by idiot Marxist professors with ponytails protesting at a BLM gathering. These policies are being passed by the lawmakers who submit to the power elite oligarch class, the wealthy class. Hence why, as Quigley shows, the whole history of leftist movements and socialist movements in America are bound up with willful, intentional support from the wealthiest foundations in America. And until that is figured out, nothing will change. Because progressivism has behind it, at all times and always will, the money class. And that includes the power elite, CEO, industrial class. The money class and the industrial class have a vested interest in the promotion of the leftist values and destructive, toxic gibberish, precisely because it creates a society, as we said, that appeals to the lowest common denominator, is based around base desires. What better way, if you're an oligarch, to control the population by turning them into beasts and animals who are completely run by their basest drives, food and sex and security. Thus, the more you debase the society, the easier they are to control and to collectivize into a glob that you can turn at will. And so the money class and the corporate class will always have a vested interest. I'm not talking about the local business owner. I'm talking about the 0.01%, the real power elite, the Fortune 100, the private Federal Reserve banks, the real power elite, and all of the goons that serve that. They will always have a vested interest in the promotion of vice to degrade the society, to create the controllable, base desire controlled society. And then they are given forms which aren't really real to make the people feel like and think that they're part of the process, part of the power structure. Power comes from the bottom up, when power has never really come from the bottom up, and it has always been accorded to people on the basis of the actual power elite, who are, guess what? The people with the money. Senators, average Joe, they don't have power. Senators have a degree of power. But who do you think has more power? Senator Joe Schmo, who leaves Congress, even in the best case, or leaves the Senate, even in the best case of insider trading with $5 to $10 million after his, or a guy with $70 billion. Who has more power, Ron Paul or Jeff Bezos? Now, who has more power, one senator or a couple senators, or a conglomeration of a cartel of military-industrial complex companies that have, say, the collective wealth of... Look, okay, who's got more power, Rand Paul or BlackRock? And who's so stupid as to think that the power really resides in the democratically elected officials? That power is very limited. But as part of the myth that liberal societies collectively believe and are raised and propagandized to believe, or else they would realize that none of that's actually true, and they're controlled by a small oligarchical elite, as Bernays brags and laughs at in the first chapter of Propaganda. In other words, Edward Bernays gives this whole thing away. He says, you live in a democratic society where you think that you're run by the public elected institutions. No. You're run by the oligarchical elite, who are social engineers and technocrats and zillionaires that know you like they know a pet. That's how you're run. But you don't even know that, because you believe in the myth, the religion of democracy. So, my view is that because people who are leftist, revolutionary-minded, narcissistic, damaged, not well individuals as they progress in leftism, liberalism, as they are more and more divorced from reality, this is why you see them acting and manifesting in such bizarre meltdown ways. This is why they're losing their mind, why they get crazier and crazier. There is no bottom to this until they're basically nihilistically negating themselves, if you catch my meaning. I mean, some of the most radical leftists have actually said there is no other ultimate revolutionary action but unaliving yourself. You realize some of them have actually said that. I mean, I think, doesn't even Sartre has a short story called The Wall, if I remember. And I think that's the point of the story, is like, look, I mean, if you're a real, true, committed revolutionary Marxist socialist, then you need to unalive yourself. Because it's the ultimate way of saying, so the argument goes, I am a master of whatever I want and no one oppresses me. I'm not going to be oppressed by the identity that I'm told I have. And guess what? That's exactly what happens to then the next postmodern phase of all of this, which is identity as oppressor. Victim status, right, goes along with the oppressed mythology, which may or may not be true. But if reality then is power politics, as we're beginning to realize, even though originally the revolutionaries were saying that the source of man's problems were in power. Now we're getting to the point where there's a postmodern turn, especially after World War II, when the left began to realize that most of their hopes and dreams for a humanistic, future society, humanist manifesto type bullshit that like Matt Dillahunty preaches, right? This kind of stuff, well, it just doesn't fit with the realities of another world war after World War One. So something must be off, such that maybe man himself is the problem. Again, exactly the thing Huxley tells you, right? I'm going to play the reason I have this up is that it's the clip that I found of collective. I thought he was going to play leftists having breakdowns, but he's just going to play one. There's another little clip I have of that too. So again, why all of these women who are so committed to their sacrament of abortion? Well, because they're part of this death cult, which adopted after World War II, totally aligned itself with the Malthusian environmental movement and totally aligned itself with the anti-natalist idea of the Malthusians. And so, what is that but a death cult? Man is the source of all the problems. Man himself must be gotten rid of. There must be a revolution against man himself. Man must exist in lesser and lesser numbers, depop, Malthusian. And combined with postmodernism, the idea that in terms of identity, there is no identity. It is purely caused and socially created by the individual or the social. So identity becomes social construct. Why? Well, this goes all the way back to the rejection of essences in the Enlightenment. Things don't have natures or essences. Everything is evolving and in flux. And so if there's everything in flux, then there's no essence or nature that has a, steady existence over time. There's just matter in motion, and then the words that we make up to call that matter in motion something explicable, something predicable, something meaningful. So it sheds the Enlightenment baggage of the universalized ideas because there's nothing universal. Eventually, by the time of the 20th century, Leftism is a combination of its capitalist principles of the beginning of individual revolution, elements of socialism and collectivism, and now elements of postmodernism and power dynamics in politics and Nietzscheanism. Actually, Nietzsche had an effect on the left, believe it or not. In fact, the Frankfurt School took its Nietzschean turn in the Horkheimer and Adorno Dialectic of Enlightenment book, where they point out that World War II killed the progressive ideas of leftism and destroyed the Enlightenment, liberal, utopian ideas. World War II ended that, and the Nietzschean turn, meaning the anti-human turn of the elite power, the power elite left, became dominant. So we live in this era when the left is a very bizarre mix of confluences and factors that, on the one hand, for example, the atomized individual of the Adam Smith laissez-faire period is still there. It still underlies the West in terms of liberal thought. I am an individual. Nothing tells me what I am. I determine my destiny. I am a libertine individual. Blah, blah, all this gibberish, right? Which is premised on the exact same basis as the collectivist socialist, and is still the basis of today's woke person, that they will determine what they are by their own divine fiat. If I feel like a woman right now, then by golly, I'm a bitch. And by the way, now I feel like I'm a man, by golly, I'm a dude. And who are you to tell me that I'm wrong? You're oppressing me. If you tell me that I can't do that, or if that's wrong, those are your standards and you are oppressing me right now, bro. Whoa, dude. Step back. Social distance, because you're oppressing me right now. Thus, the illogic, I should say, of the left that you guys have probably heard this, right? Math is racist. Logic is oppressive and racist. Education, big words, are I'm serious. There's a reason for all of this. Because it's no longer truth or falsehood. Remember, it's power dynamics, power oppressor. For the left, for today's leftists especially, everything is power dynamic, which is so ironic given the origins of the left against power corrupting. This is why when you try to engage with people of this manifestation, you should say, they're not logical or rational, just like the Marxist is not logical or rational, like a Haas. Because logic and rationality serve the revolution. Logic and rationality are the tools and the means by which you express power. You see how it's not what we believe? We think we're arguing and debating to get to truth. No. The Marxist is arguing and debating to further the revolution. There's no truth here. It's really irrelevant here. And so it's all display and power dynamic. Do you remember when Haas came on to debate? Screaming, cussing, talking over all his nonsense. That's because he's acting in praxis. He's doing radical action to further the revolution, because that's all there is. There's not truth versus falsehood. And if we just debate this out in a rational way, perhaps both of us will, in humbleness, achieve a greater likelihood to know the truth. No, none of that. It's all power dynamics. In fact, there was a great quote from a feminist. I can't remember who it was. No, I'm sorry. I remember what it was. It was in a book on leftism and postmodernism. And they were making the point. Oh, I remember what it was. There was a so-called scholar woman who had been, this was some decades ago, a couple decades ago, she was promoting a fake gospel. That's what it was. There was a forged fake gospel, and like maybe it didn't even exist, right? For the sake of argument, it was something like, this female women's studies scholar from Harvard was working on, exposing the gospel of Mary Magdalene or something. I mean, just come up with whatever, right? And it turned out that didn't. In other words, she was gonna publish on it to prove, right, that the church was patriarchal and had oppressed and stamped out the true, feminine, divine Christianity or some bullcrap like this, right? Well, it turned out that her scholarship was all false. It was like made up, fake, forged, right, fake and gay. And when she was kind of being, dealt with by the university or whoever, people sued her or whatever, and this was amazing insight here. She said, "Well, but it didn't matter whether it was true or not because I was opposing the hierarchy and the patriarchy, and so that made it okay." She literally argued this, and what an amazing window into the thought process. Not just of the Marxists. Everybody knows Marxists operate in this really disingenuous, raucous way for agitprop. But even the just normie leftist scholar at Harvard thought it was completely justified to wholesale fabricate Gnostic gospels that would supposedly disprove Christianity and patriarchal. But she was doing it to tear down the patriarchy, man. The same kind of logic that, for example, a woman might, say, concoct a lie about a man. A great story. Oh, well, but he deserved it because he's part of the patriarchy. I mean, you see how silly this would be. But that's the thought process of many leftists who are aligned with wickedness, lies, deception, because there's nothing wrong with those things. Those are just actions to further the agenda. In the days of the Marxist socialists, it was radical action to further the revolution. To today's leftists, there's not really ideology. And I think that's the interesting element of today's left, which is that in the past, it seems like the left was almost always, even in the period of the Enlightenment, even if it was negative liberty, it had a lot of these very lofty intellectual components and ideas and books and treatises. And what's amazing about today's left is that it really has no principles at all. There's perhaps this idea of negative liberty in the sense of opposing something. But there's no need for any consistency in what's opposed. For example, you can be opposed to war and government one year, and then you're opposed to corporations, and within a few years, you're pro corporation and war and government. I mean, there's no logic to it at all. It's more so whatever you're told to do. And so ironically, it morphs into this almost totalitarian cult with absolutely no ideology. Which from an oligarch perspective is kind of amazing. Like, I mean, if you're an oligarch, that's perfect. A giant mob of idiots who will believe and do anything you tell them. That's power. And that's, I think, perhaps the worst, scariest part, as I said, is there are, and people are arguing about the number of, it doesn't matter the number of the real, whether it's actually 60 million that Harris got in the popular, or actually it was 70 million that she got because of illegals. It doesn't matter. Any amount of votes for her in the tens of millions is just a shocking insight into how many people in this country are mentally unstable, mentally ill, and are just totally gone or out to lunch. It's just wild. And so that, I mean, is that not an attestation to the absurdity of the left, which in its beginnings is about freedom, is about limiting the state, is about lofty ideals, universal principles, morals, limiting power, to the left essentially being an absolute worship of power, a complete disregard for critical thinking, an absolute top-down control mechanism and mindset. Not the limiting of power, but the destruction of limits of power to give to the corporate state God power is now the essence of the left. That's pretty wild. But it actually makes perfect sense if the left was always the tool of the money power and the corporate power. If that's the case, then there's actually a really consistent, coherent logic to the left. And that's what you're never going to get from a Matt Walsh or anybody else in the normie sphere. They can never tell you or connect the dots between the money power and the left, and even the corporate industrial power in the left. They must always abide by the acceptable false dialectic of big government versus libertarian economic freedom. And they're operating at such a low, uneducated normie sphere that they can't even understand it. And so because leftism leads towards nihilism, leads towards atheism, leads towards death cult, it must of necessity become a death cult. Every cult must have a high priest hierarchical system of some kind. It must have sacrifice. It must have the components that make up a religious cult. What do you know? It manifests as a feminist, goddess, male cucked, magical thinking, postmodern death cult.
A most auspicious of days, my friends, I give you a collection of coat and seed. Because you deserve it. Because you have suffered through high gas prices, high rent, a bad economy in general. Jobs, the jobs report that just came out was miserable. An open border. But either way, there needs to be a hard lesson to the people. Section of videos, which I've already played in an earlier segment, but I have much, much more, my friends, because Reddit is a glorious cesspit of whinging. With histrionic personality disorder saying, I just woke up and saw the results. I swear to God, I'm done with you, self. Would sooner put the cope.
I was saying that when you play the meltdowns over each other like this, it sounds like the screams of hell. It's like you're hearing it to Hades or something. All right, let's try it this way. Trump won. He's got painted nails. He's a real liberal.
How did we get here? What in the Alice in Wonderland nightmares is going on right now?
All I can say is how fucking dare you.
If you voted for that man, if you voted for anybody other than Kamala, and you live in one of the states that it was, close, or if you didn't vote, fuck you.
It's not gonna happen. Go, Kamala.
I chose family. I chose women. I chose America. I love you.
How the fuck is this still happening? All I've ever known politically is hatred.
I'm done. I'm done. I'm done. I'm done with you. I'm done with you and your mother and your sister. I'm just done with all of this.
I'm sorry to all my friends who are Trump supporters. I don't understand how scared of this man I am.
If this guy does end up winning again, all of the people who voted for him will be like happy and they'll just be celebrating. And everyone else, everyone who feels threatened by him is fucking scared. Like we're scared for our lives. We're scared for our friends.
How dare you put this man into office for another 4 years, knowing damn well what.
What are they actually afraid of? I don't understand what they're afraid of. They're acting like they're going to die because of Trump getting elected. I mean, it's just so divorced from reality. I can't understand what they're actually afraid of. It's bizarre.
What it means for our country, what it means for us as a people.
To know that there is that much ignorance and that much hate in this country, it's so terrifying. It's so terrifying. How the fuck are we back in this same situation again? Who the fuck is voting for him? Genuinely.
Fuck you. I don't want to hear about how shitty your life gets under his policies. Live with that decision. Sit with it.
Do they think that there's like actual hit squads that are going to be going out like mercs, like mercenaries? So they think that Like, is crystal knocked tomorrow when Trump gets inaugurated? Is crystal knocked? Wow. I mean, it's like they're having like their own fantasies. Like they're over there pretending that they're Anne Frank in some kind of weird fantasy, and like Tiny Mustache Man, Merc Squad, orange jumpsuit. It won't be the brown shirts. It'll be the orange shirts. Like Trump's going to send the orange shirt squad in. And by the way, these funky leftist chicks are having fantasies too. They're like, oh, I just wish a brown shirt would come bust in here and try to murk me. I would show him what it is to be a man because he thinks he's a man. I would make him a man. You know what I mean? Like, they're having like just these weird, because these people are all weirdos, dude. These people are crazy. They're all over there pretending that they're damn other kin, chicks identifying as squirrels and shit, right? I'm a squirrel. You can't tell me what to do. I identify as a squirrel. I'll eat nuts if I want to on a tree limb. You can't stop me. You can't judge me. I identify as what I want. I'm a squirrel, bitch. Except not Peanut. You don't want. If you identify as a squirrel, the government will come get your ass. It wasn't Trump that murked Peanut. I hate to tell y'all. It wasn't Trump. It was that New York Democrat regime that murked on Peanut. And that Rocky the Raccoon or whatever his name was. Anyway.
Let it make you uncomfortable. Fuck you.
Look at these beautiful ladies.
Orange pumpkin, you just caused me one of the most important people in my life. My dad.
Well, her problem is she can't say her R's. Right? That's her problem.
As Claire McCaskill will determine, you okay?
I think I'm okay.
Tell me what you're thinking.
Well, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of her. I don't think people realize how hard it is.
By the way, I had another note I forgot to mention. What was it? Oh, because the power dynamics dictate everything, and there's nothing to do with truth. It's just power dynamics. The left is fully powered by emo, thus more conducive to weak, feminized men who are controlled by their emotions, women who are oftentimes pretty much controlled by their emotions, gravitate towards this leftist cult groups. Even though they're death cults, everything in it is about emotion and feeling. The ads are about how the policies of Trump makes you feel. Everything is about whether a person makes you feel good. The Feely Society is actually the society premised around the dark triad traits, as that paper shows. The dark triad traits and the narcissistic personality. We've referenced this paper many times. It's a very insightful paper. Everybody should read it if you haven't read it. Narcissistic personality disorders and the dark triad traits, and how very cunning, psychopathic, narcissistic individuals thrive in societies based around victimhood status because they can play on the oppressed victim status and thus gain more points in the society, gain more power in the society through the oppression matrix. The more oppressed, the more victimized, the more attention, money, and power one can potentially gain in these so-called democratic societies based around leftism and liberalism. But remember, they're not the old progressive liberalism anymore. They're postmodern power dynamic liberalism based around pure power politics. And so everything is subjected to and subordinate to, ironically, power. Truth underneath power. There is no truth but who has the power. And if the left can if the left can attain enough power, what they say is true. That's their belief. Power is what determines truth for the left. There is no truth that those in power are subjected to that's objective truth. That doesn't exist. It is always purely power relations. Once you understand that, and that the person that you're interacting with who's a committed leftist is not working on the principles of reason and logic, but on pure power dynamics, you begin to understand the real logic of the left and how they act the way they do. But remember, to control a large base, the easiest way to do that, as we said, right, by the oligarch or the oligarchy, is how? To make them run on their base passions. The more base and the more controlled by their desires they are, the easier they are to control, the more predictable they are. And remember, that's also tied to their emotions, manipulating them on the basis of their emotions are also kind of base desires in a way, or they're the manifestation of kind of base desires. They're not bad, but you can't be controlled by your emotions. You can't run a society based around emotional sentiment or how things make people feel. But this is precisely where today's left is that a society based around feelies. And good and evil then are power relations. And if you said something to hurt someone, that's a power dynamic, you see. You shouldn't have the power to hurt me. And your words are hate speech precisely because they might be true. But remember, this position is all about discarding and opposing what is actually true and making truth the product and being determined by power. Now, what I'm telling you is not what the average, it's somewhat the manifestation of the psyche of the average street leftist, your family leftist. But the real cunning is the technocrat social engineer elite above these people that really run things who are really malicious. And they know and understand the kind of dynamic that I'm talking about. They know, as Bernays says, that they're manipulating a giant glob hive mind of idiots. And they have a vested interest in keeping them idiots. How do you keep people idiots? You don't teach them logic and critical thinking. I mean, obviously, you promote the passions and the vices, right? Obviously, all of that. But the last thing that a cult leader wants is a bunch of cult members who utilize critical thinking and critique the cult leader. What better way to control people than to bypass their reasoning faculty to get them to act and react on the basis of emotion? You got it. And that's what most propaganda is. Emotion-based, very simple, basic type stuff. Oh, you voted for the Big Don? You must be a fascist and you hate women. That's an irrational, bizarre, emotional type of appeal. I mean, it's an ad hominem, obviously, but, you see this in political ads all the time, right? A vote for Kamala Harris is a vote for women. In other words, Kamala Harris, because she's a woman, must therefore care about women and women's rights and what's best for women. And Donald Trump, being a man, can't and doesn't care about women and must be a rapist. Even though that's never been proven, there's no law or, there's no case that proves that. It's just what works. That's how you fight the system, even if it's not true.
have rights tomorrow.
Oh, mother.
Wait, no. It's time to go to bed. None of us are stressed about the election, right? We all are gonna just go have the best night's sleep of our lives, aren't we?
It's gonna ding the copyright.
Go. We don't even have to fucking, we don't have to freak out. We don't have to freak out because it's not even real. Because, bitch, freak out the vote!
Guys, I just voted, and I chose family.
End this reign of terror now.
I chose family, I chose women, I chose America.
The reign of terror.
I'm gonna I'm getting revved up here on a significant rant. So, because Kamala Harris is not winning, and the people who thought that Kamala Harris was going to win in a landslide are totally wrong.
This black chick really is really angry. Now, some of these people are hamming it up for their stupid ass TikTok audience, but still, it's just, wow. All these have songs that are going to ding the copyright. Well, here's a dude. Dude's not even talking, he's just crying. 7 minutes of crying.
Not a kid.
Oh, these TikTok songs are the worst, dude. Ooh, ugh.
You will ever realize you have 0 point. 0. And they're going to continue to do it. They're going to continue.
That's annoying. Yeah, here we go.
Right? Like we're just gonna wake up tomorrow morning and everything's gonna go back to the way it...
It's all like white chicks too that are all in these videos, and black chicks and gay dudes, right? Anyway, you get the idea. Enough of that stuff. We got some super chats. No way, $5. Saw Trump gave a shout out to monophysites. Do you think his presidency will have any impact on orthodoxy? I mean, he's better for orthodoxy than Kamala. I don't expect a lot more than that. I don't know what the monophysite thing was. Guala Christ, $10. Jay, big Guala doinks in the chat. Don Johnson looking like a vaporware philosopher king. That's right, baby. Bring up those Christ warriors. Bring up Tom Skanks. Who's Tom Skanks? Maverick Jones, $3. Why don't you like the British royal family? Well, I mean, they're big proponents of the Malthusian and socialist ideologies that we're talking about. Will you debate Vaush or Hassan Piker? I don't think those guys are interested in a debate with me. I think it was discussed of trying to, I think Andrew was trying to get me a debate with Vaush at one time, and I said yes, and then I never heard back. So I guess Vaush wasn't interested. Hassan Piker, I doubt he would be interested, but I would debate those dudes, sure. Basic expert, $5. On tariffs, how would you respond to Hazlitt or Bastiat that cheaper foreign products may ruin some local businesses, but the consumer has more money in his pocket to support businesses? Working this out in my head. I don't know that there is some easy answer, but I know that there's probably got to be some balance here, because obviously you can have an over-restrictive state. We all know that. But at the same time, it becomes an impetus for the ruler to enrich himself through deals that are made to allow for foreign entities to come in and put everybody out of business. So, I mean, let's look at Walmart in small towns. I don't know what the answer is to that. There may not be an easy answer. Just Gerald 2676. From all of us at the Crucible, thank you for all that you do. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Roll Sticks, $5. I'd love to see someone break down Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, his psychological and ideological analyses. That probably should be one we do next. I mean, we're having a lot of fun. I'm having a lot of fun doing the literature streams. Nobody watches them. I mean, they get 7,000 views. They're still fun to do, but I just, like, people don't want to be educated. They want to be idiots. They want to watch TikTok videos all day, and they don't want to watch and read a book. I guess they can't read books. So, but maybe we should do Catcher in the Rye next. Eugene, $5. I just got Esoteric Hollywood too. Thanks, bro. Hey, thank you. Appreciate that. Guys, if you want to get, of course, signed copies of my books, if you head on over to the shop at jaysanalysis.com, all of the books there are, of course, signed. So you don't have to request. A lot of people send messages and say, hey, can you sign the book? And look, there is a place to leave a note if you want to sign in some specific way. I usually just make it out to the name of the person that ordered the book. But every book is signed, so you don't have to worry. If you order Esoteric Hollywood, Meta Narratives, or the Red Book, they're going to be signed. Every book from the website is signed. And here is the shop if you're interested in getting those books. And hopefully, as I've said, Esoteric Hollywood 3 will be ready in the next couple months. I've got 300 pages, and I need to get to about 350 to 400. So hopefully we'll be there pretty soon. And it's going to be a lot of fun. It's taking longer than the other ones are, but that's okay. What am I looking for? Chalk. Also, remember to head on over to chalk.com, the show sponsor. And you're not going to be paying $174. You're going to be paying 44% off of that with the promo code J44Life. That's JAY44LIFE over at chalk.com. Yes, Chalk really does work. It is an excellent adaptogen and supplement company that really puts everything into the product. I mean, they don't spare any expense when it comes to the purity, when it comes to finding the best sources for their supplementation, like the rainforest, actually the Tonkat Ali, for example. All their products are 100% pure, purer than so-called organic. They're very strict about that. And the products actually work. You can read the peer-reviewed studies, particularly about the Tonkat Ali, showing that it does boost testosterone. But there's a lot of other great products too, like the Action 2.0, the Chad Mode pre-workout. You can get that performance stack there for almost half off of that with the promo code JAY44LIFE. You can unsubscribe at any time, but I think you're going to want that coming on the regular. It makes it really easy. You don't have to keep, you forget, oh, I forgot to order more chalk. It'll come on the regular. But if you don't with the subscription model, you can use the promo code JAY40 to just get 40% off a single order. No, it is not. Everybody who uses it will tell you that they're great products. I don't push crappy stuff here. Dacian, $5. I appreciate this level-headed king. Well, thank you so much. I would prefer to call myself a level-headed queen, but you call me what you want, baby. Anonymous, $5. I read Hoffman and SS, the beginning of talks, the PBS Frontline episode. I don't know what that is. Hoffman SS, talking about PBS Frontline. Organ Farm, discussing Organ Farm. PBS Frontline episode on an organ farm discussing xenotransplantation, and it's wiped off the web. I'm not familiar with that, man. I don't know. A lot of stuff has been wiped off the web, though. Aaron Weinzierl, $10. Here's a little more from my Bitcoin profits today. It was a Trumpadunk, as you said. Oh, yeah, by the way, yeah, I mean, pretty much everything we said last night came true. And I think what to expect now, as we said, I think they're going to pull out all the stops. We're going to have some new form of lawfare, Russiagate 3.0. It may not be Russia, it may be something else. They're going to continue to try some kind of crazy narrative. They would probably really like to have RACE type provocations. And so I think people need to be very leery of anything like that. Stay away from anything like that, obviously. Probably some of these fake cutout militia or front groups could be used for something. This is the type of time when something like OKC, right, or perhaps World War III. But it's hard to say because things haven't worked. They might go for the economic collapse because they're handing Trump, this terrible, money printer, zillion-dollar inflation economy. And so, maybe it's time for Cyber Polygon. Maybe it's time for, something like that. It's hard to know what they're going to throw. What do you guys think the system will throw up next? Could be any of that or all the above. But I think that's what we need to be watching for. Dead by Sunu, $5. Thank you so much. Alula, $5. Let's go. We won. I'm an Ethiopian. I love you. I love white people. Best day ever. Glory to God. Jesus, our King and God. Well, thank you, Alula. Appreciate that. Rachel Wilson, $50. Thank you. That's a big fat super chat. Appreciate that. A piece called Spoon in 48. Spoon. Soon in 48 years' time by the Bolshevik propagandist Alexandra Kollontai. We've mentioned her, of course, many times because Rachel hit me to her. In her book, we actually covered that documentary, too, that covers the Bolshevik sexual revolution. And Rachel's book is Occult Feminism, so be sure and check that out. It's a great example of what you're talking about. In it, future young revolutionaries say to the older Bolsheviks, you subdued the social forces, we will subdue nature. Yeah, so the revolution has to always be progressing, even if there's no such thing as progress, because it must always tear down the existing. Glitchy Rhythm, $5. Happy Trump Day. Praying that Trump will pardon people from the Jan event and end Ukraine. Yeah, I think Zelensky was already like, all right, I'm ready for peace. So he may be sensing that won't continue on. Naj00, $10. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, look, we already covered all the reality of Trump stuff last night, so I'm not going to rehearse all that, but, hope for the best. Real J Dyer, $6.69. Trump was elected. Do you think will he release Area 51? And as we formally requested, will those aliens be twerking? Yes. I can guarantee you, I have spoken to Roger Stone, and he has told me that probably highest up on Trump's priority is releasing the aliens that are housed at Area 51, and the government's not letting them twerk. It's actually part of their culture, alien culture, to twerk. And the government is oppressing them by having them strapped down. They can't even twerk. So, yes. Zach McConnell, $5. Do you feel like these Enlightenment Masonic figures plan for their ideology to devolve into what it has now become? No, I think probably most of them were men of their time, and they thought that they were really expressing positions that would create new societies. I think many of them really believed it. If anybody was like completely malicious, I mean, that would be more like a Marquis de Sade or somebody like that who just didn't care and, misanthrope type person, or Rousseau maybe. But even those guys were so narcissistic and huffing their own toots that they believed that they were going to change the world. Remember, these are delusional people. A lot of these revolutionaries from this time, they think they're like God people, like they're going to save the world, and they're female Jesuses, like they're crazy. Jourdain, $20. Have you ever thought of doing a philosophy of history series? It's an interesting thought. I'm just concerned about I mean, I think doing the philosophy course that I did worked out well because there's enough of an interest in people, the people have in philosophy, that they would buy a philosophy course. I do have a concern, though, of putting so much time and effort into creating a philosophy of history course that there's not enough people that would buy that. So the thing about doing a whole philosophy series or something like I did with Richard is like, that took a lot of time. It took many weeks. You know, Kai is figuring this out now. Kai is essentially doing with the Oriental position, you know, if we're going to do 10, 12 talks, that's basically what I was doing for the lecture series, the philosophy lectures. So you have to think about, what I really wanted to do was like an espionage, like history of modern espionage, something like that, or British intelligence history. But I don't think enough people will buy that. There's just like probably, 10 people that care enough about that to even listen to it in toto. But you know what surprised me today? I would have never guessed. And I'm wondering if most people don't understand this meme, because I can't imagine that these many people have read the C.S. Lewis space trilogy. But this was one of the oddest things to go viral when I shared this meme. It's hard for me to believe that the 500,000 people that saw this, I take that back because maybe they've seen it, but the 1,000 people that shared it and 15,000 people that liked it, that many people read Hideous Strength? I mean, it's a difficult book. So anyway, but I've done talks through the space trilogy too. But Pino, $3. The soy rage TikTok clips are all overgrown toddler people. Yeah, we should have mentioned that a big part of leftism and liberalism is arrested development and not maturing. That's why it appeals, obviously, to the youth. It appeals to people who are neotenous. And they just naturally... Destiny is the archetype of this kind of a arrested development, physically deformed weirdo, vile person who is really just the embodiment of all of what we're talking about in terms of leftist ideology. Completely controlled by passions, malicious, just disgusting. Anyway, Mate, the agent and scholar, $3. I love you, Jay, no homo. I also like you, no homo. All right. Remember, guys, we have a Icon conference. You can still get tickets if you're in the Florida area. The Icon conference is right here. I'll put the link in the show description. It'll be me, Father Vladimir, Father Deacon Ananias, Father Theodore, and it's going to be a fun day of lectures, talks on really deep subjects. It's going to get pretty deep, and we're going to have a great time. Come check out the church. Let's see what else. Don't know if I'll be hosting Lord Voldemort this week. Of course, now we are entering in the phase of potentially the last week of Lord Voldemort. So it's all up in the air. We don't know what's going to happen. I hope to continue in some capacity, doing stuff. I think that would be cool. It's been 4 years, almost 5, of the 4th hour. It's been a great experience. I'm very thankful for that opportunity to have been able to speak to so many people on such a wide audience, millions of people. I learned a lot. I think I got better, hopefully, at doing that 4th hour style of presentation. It opened a lot of doors with other opportunities, other shows, other podcasts, big shows, big opportunities, big podcasts. That led to the Tucker thing, that led to going on Timcast, it led to other things. So hopefully, things don't go bad. November, 12th, 13th, I think. But even if, Info W, even if it's the end of that, obviously it's not the end of Lord Voldemort. he will continue to do podcasts, and I know him on a personal level, so I text with him, and so I think there's always the possibility of some kind of collaborations in the future. Again, it just really sucks because everybody who works at InfoW is really cool. They're all great people. I've met them and hung out with them many times, and I don't want to see them not continuing on to do the good work that they're doing. But we don't know. It's all up in the air. But I'm always going to be doing my thing. Always going to be doing these live streams. Always going to be, writing books, going on podcasts, and hopefully now expanding to doing, in the future, more and more live events. Last year was our experiment with live events. We did 5 or 6 last year. I thought it was great. Had a blast. This year, we did 2 or 3. This is the 3rd. So not as many this year as we did last year, but those are a lot of fun. So I hope to continue doing that. Dacian Jerdon, $5. Allegedly, Monica went public because Bill was sneaking in some of those aliens and he was watching them twerk illegally. That is actually the true history from Mossad. Mossad has actually leaked that it was actually aliens twerking, correct. Dacian, $3. Jay, are the books that you mentioned in your stream added to the recommended reading on your website? No. I don't remember if Fire in the Minds of Men is on the website. I probably need to update the recommended reading on the website because that was I haven't updated that in a few years. So I have no idea if that book is on there. But anyway, thank you guys so much for the super chats. You can always support via Bitcoin right here. This is my wallet. If you listen to me, even last night, I mean, Bitcoin has been awesome. Good job. Way to go, BTC. Up there, hanging around 75. That's all good. And let's see. We got another super chat. Alex Ham, $35. Jay, you have great content. Hi. I don't think a global cyber polygon is off the table. Yeah, I mean, that's what Klaus said eventually will come. It hasn't happened yet. So we got RACE agitprop events / OKC type of an event or World War III or cyber polygon economic collapse. I mean, it's got to be something in this or a combination. I mean, I don't think the demic doesn't really seem to. I don't think people are going to go for that, but they might go for something else. What do you guys think? Now, I have to admit, I do think they're going to make another move against Trump. So I think the deep state will make those moves. Probably see some more of those lunatic type Wesley Ralph and Crooks types. Probably see some more of those loons thinking they're saving us from Tiny Mustache Man or whatever brainwashing they believe. And then there is the wild card. The thing I don't think they're going to use the alien wild card because every time they keep pushing alien crap, have you noticed this with alien crap? It's like it doesn't really get any traction. Like they push it and push it. They've even went the government's full on oh yeah, there's aliens, right? With these congressional stupid hearings last year, and it's kind of like nobody really cared. So they could throw a wild card with alien. I think that's the least likely scenario. The alien, the fake and gray alien psyop. Because I think they have to push that enough to where enough people believe it. I think there's too many people that are skeptical, and the staged alien invasion is just kind of too outlandish. It's much more likely that, we're going to get larger theater of war, fake flag type stuff for some idiot front group or something like that. That's what I think. But nobody expected Koof, and that was pretty well. Alex says, I think they might be able to take out the power grid, and then they could do something in the meantime. They might do a financial reset. Yeah, I mean, they don't need alien. You didn't say aliens. I don't know why they said aliens. Yeah, I mean, a cyber polygon could be great for something like that, for sure. So that's definitely possible.